After a long day of hiking through the dense forest of the Swiss Alps, our group of 4 arrived at our campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. We were all exhausted from the 12-mile trek, but there was something oddly satisfying about reaching the end of our trail. The trees surrounded us in a protective embrace, their tall trunks rising up like silent sentinels. We quickly unloaded our backpacks and began setting up our tents. It didn't take long before the fire pit was dug, and we had a small fire crackling away, throwing warm light into the gathering dusk. There was something comforting about the flames as they flickered, casting long shadows around us. I sat by the fire, peeling off my boots and sighing with relief as I stretched my sore feet out. Emily, always the one to take charge of everything, made sure the fire was well fed with wood. She was in her late 20s, a few years younger than me, but had this no-nonsense attitude that made her a natural leader. Emily had organized this trip, and while I had my reservations about the remote location, I trusted her judgment. Our group consisted of me, Emily, and 2 of our friends. Daniel, a quiet, introverted guy in his early 30s, and Nora, a woman around my age who loved to joke and always lighten the mood, even when things felt tense. We hadn't been on a hiking trip like this for a while, and the thrill of being out in the wilderness felt like the perfect escape. That night, we roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and laughed. But as the fire began to die down, I couldn't help but notice how still the forest had become. There was no wind rustling through the trees, no chirping of crickets, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of the firewood settling. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, that I heard it, a faint rustling from somewhere in the dark woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a squirrel moving through the underbrush. We were far from any towns, and wildlife was common in these parts. I glanced over at the others. They didn't seem to notice it. Emily was talking to Nora about some new hiking gear she had bought. Daniel was fiddling with his phone, his face lit by the dim light, and Nora was half listening, half staring into the fire. I shrugged off the unease that crawled up my spine and returned my focus to the fire. But the rustling continued, faint but persistent. It seemed to be moving closer, just beyond the tree line. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight I had left by my pack. "I'll check it out," I said, my voice sounding less certain than I wanted it to. Emily gave me a quick glance but didn't argue. "Be careful." I stepped away from the warmth of the fire, the cool night air hitting my skin. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and thick underbrush. I scanned the area, but all I could see were the outlines of the towering pines, their trunks seeming to stretch endlessly into the night. Nothing.
Ibaita moment, listening.
The rustling had stopped. Maybe it had just been a small animal after all. I made my way back to the camp, shaking my head at myself. The wilderness could make you paranoid, I supposed. "I don't know what I was thinking," I said as I sat back down beside the fire. Emily didn't look up. She seemed a little distant, like her mind was somewhere else. The rest of the night passed without incident. We all settled into our tents by 11 p.m., the forest around us eerily silent. Sleep came easily, my body too tired to keep up with any lingering worries. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp earth and the sound of birds calling in the distance. The camp was quiet, too quiet. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, blinking against the bright morning light. That's when I noticed something strange. Daniel's tent was empty. It wasn't just that he was gone. His sleeping bag and gear were still inside. His pack, the one he always kept by his side, was untouched. It was as if he had gotten up and walked away in the middle of the night. "Emily," I called softly, stepping over to her tent. She emerged a moment later, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" I pointed to Daniel's tent. "He's gone." She looked at the empty space, Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. Where would he have gone? It's too early for him to be off hiking alone. We both stood there, staring at the tent for a moment. I don't know why, but I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a feeling I couldn't shake. This wasn't just a case of him waking up early and going for a walk. Something was wrong. Nora came out of her tent a few moments later, stretching and yawning. "What's going on?" "Daniel's missing," I said, my voice tight, face paled. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean, he's gone," Emily said, frustration creeping into her voice. "His tent's still here, but there's no sign of him." We started searching immediately, checking the area around the campsite. We called his name, though I knew it was pointless. The forest was dense, and there were no signs of a struggle, no obvious trail that would lead us to him. Felt like he had just vanished into thin air. Then we noticed something strange. There were footprints, barefoot, odd-shaped, and leading away from the camp into the forest. They didn't look like they had been made by a wild animal. They were too human, but not quite right. The stride was uneven, as though whoever made them was stumbling, or perhaps dragging their feet. We followed the prints for what felt like hours. Every so often, we would find small signs that something had disturbed the ground. The rustle of leaves, a branch broken low to the ground, but it all felt disjointed, like the trail had been deliberately left to confuse us. The deeper we went into the forest, the more unsettling it became. The silence was oppressive. It felt like the trees themselves were watching us. Eventually, the trail stopped, right in the middle of a clearing. The footprints simply disappeared, as if they had vanished into thin air. We searched the area for any signs of him, but there was nothing. Just the dense undergrowth and trees stretching up toward the sky. By now, the sun was high, and the weight of our situation began to settle in. Daniel was gone, and we had no idea where he could be. "We need to call for help," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. But her phone had no signal, and mine didn't either. We were isolated, completely cut off from the world. Nora, who had been quiet up until that point, finally spoke. "What if he just wandered off? Maybe he got disoriented and—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "This doesn't feel right. Something happened here. We can't just ignore it." We spent the rest of the day searching, but it was clear that there was no simple explanation. By nightfall, we were all exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The decision was made to return to the campsite, as we had no choice but to regroup and figure out what to do next. That night, none of us could sleep. Every creak of the tent in the wind, every snap of a twig outside, had us on edge. I kept thinking about the strange footprints and how they just stopped. The longer I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Daniel hadn't just wandered off. The next morning, we packed up and hiked out as quickly as we could, sticking to the main trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting Daniel to jump out from behind a tree, laughing about some prank he'd pulled. But he didn't. He never showed up. We made it to the nearest village by late afternoon and contacted the authorities. They launched a search, but after days of combing through the forest, they came up empty-handed. There were no new clues, no sign of Daniel. We never found out what happened to him. But there's one thing I know for sure. Daniel didn't just disappear. Something happened out there in those woods. Something that none of us understood. The mystery still lingers in my mind every time I think back to that trip. We may never know the truth, but the forest kept its secrets, and I'll never forget the feeling of standing there, watching the footprints fade into nothing. I had been hiking for hours, the sun high and hot above me, the air thin and dry in the late summer heat. I didn't expect much today, just a quiet walk to clear my head. The trail had started quiet enough, an old logging road cutting through the thick pines and birches of the forest. The kind of hike you do when you just need to be alone. But as the afternoon stretched on, something changed. In the distance, I noticed a thin plume of smoke rising into the sky. It wasn't much at first, barely a wisp caught by the wind, but it caught my attention. I figured it was from a controlled burn, a routine thing they did around here. I'd been hiking in these mountains enough to know that wildfires weren't uncommon, especially in a dry year like this one. It was no big deal. I kept moving, though just a little faster now. The smoke seemed to thicken as I pressed on, and the air grew heavier. The scent of burning would sharp in my nose. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a big forest, and the fire seemed far off. It wasn't until I heard the crackling, the unmistakable sound of burning wood, that I started to worry. I stopped for a moment to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. There was something unsettling in the sound, like it was closer than I realized. The crackling became a roar, the wind picking up, pushing the smoke in thick, choking waves across the trail. I turned around, and for the first time since I'd started the hike, I noticed that the forest had become eerily quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, just the crackling fire growing louder, like it was coming straight for me. I turned back toward the trail, my heart starting to race. The only way out was the way I came, but as I jogged back, I saw the trail was already filled with people. Others who had been hiking too, now running in the opposite direction. Panic was starting to set in, and I could see it in their eyes, the fear in their faces. The fire was moving fast. I pushed through the group, trying to stay calm. But the more I looked around, the more I realized the fire was closing in, fast. The wind had picked up, and the smoke was so thick now, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The temperature had started to rise, and my skin felt hot under the heavy air. I made a snap decision. I couldn't go back the way I came. The trail was already crowded with hikers trying to escape, and it was obvious they were struggling. I couldn't stay in that chaos. I needed to find a way out of the forest, but I couldn't see any clear path. The fire was getting closer, and every step forward felt like I was walking into the heat of it. I made my way through the thick trees, ducking low and pushing branches out of the way. The trail had turned into a labyrinth of underbrush and rocks. Each step felt like a gamble, the fire growing louder, the air heavier with the scent of burning pine and ash. I could hear the crackling all around me now, not just in one direction, but from every corner. The fire was coming at me from all sides. At one point, I thought I saw an old dirt road through the trees, a possible escape route. But as I ran toward it, a sharp crack sounded from behind, and a tree branch snapped like a rifle shot. I turned just in time to see the fire leaping from the ground to the canopy above, engulfing everything in a fiery flash. The heat was unbearable, the smoke so thick that I could barely breathe. I knew I couldn't make it through that. I couldn't go forward, and I couldn't go back. Every direction was blocked by flames or falling trees. For a moment, I felt completely trapped, hopeless. But then I remembered something. There was a cabin nearby. I'd seen it on the map before, a small, isolated cabin by a lake, used mostly by hunters in the winter. I didn't know if it was still standing or if it had been abandoned, but it was my only hope. It was the only place I could think of that might be far enough from the fire to survive. I sprinted through the forest, desperate now, ignoring the stinging smoke in my eyes, the thick ash that fell like snow around me. I kept my head low, watching for any sign of the cabin. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it was just the wind or the shadows of burning trees. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been an hour or maybe more. My legs were burning, my lungs aching with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. Finally, through the haze of smoke, I saw it, the cabin. It was old, made of dark wood, with a weathered roof and a front porch that sagged with age. But it was still standing. I stumbled up the steps, my hands shaking as I reached for the door. It creaked open, and I collapsed inside, closing the door behind me. I could hear the crackling of the fire outside, but the cabin was a small fortress, its walls thick enough to keep most of the heat at bay. I tried to catch my breath, every inhale like inhaling fire, but at least I was safe. The night was long. The fire raged outside, the wind howling through the trees. I kept the door shut tight, the windows covered with whatever old sheets I could find. There was no light except for the flickering of the fire outside, casting long shadows through the small gaps in the walls. At some point, I heard voices outside. People, panicked voices, calling for help. I thought about going out, about helping, but then I remembered how close the fire was, how quickly it had consumed everything around me. There was no way I could make it back out there. No way I could risk it. As the night wore on, the smoke began to settle. The wind died down, and the air felt still, almost suffocating. But by dawn, the fire had passed, leaving only smoldering trees and ash in its wake. The world outside was eerily quiet, but it was over. I was alive. I walked outside the cabin, the heat from the ground still radiating in waves. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the destruction. The forest was scarred, the trees blackened and twisted from the flames. But there was hope too. A small patch of green survived here and there, new life beginning to sprout in the ashes. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I'd made it through. The fire had come fast, and it had taken everything in its path. But I had survived, and that was all that mattered. It was a weekend trip we had planned for months. Alex and I had been looking forward to this hiking adventure ever since we bought the cabin last year. It was secluded, tucked in the woods of Vermont, our perfect getaway from the noise of city life. We both needed a break. We'd been living in the chaos of everyday life for far too long, and I could feel the weight of it all on my shoulders. The fresh air, the quiet, the promise of a few days away from everything. It was exactly what we needed. I should have known that things wouldn't go as planned. The first few hours were blissful. We hiked through the dense woods, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. The sky above us was clear, the sun peeking through the leaves, casting a warm glow on the forest floor. We talked about everything: work, our families, what we wanted from this cabin, and how much we were looking forward to the next few days. It felt good to be out there together, away from the noise and the responsibilities of daily life. But then, as we neared a fork in the trail, things started to change. We'd reached a point where the path split, the left one winding deeper into the forest and the right one leading towards the river. We'd been hiking for hours, and I could see that Alex was getting frustrated. I hadn't noticed before, but now I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept looking at the map and then back at the trails as though there was a choice he needed to make. "Let's take the shortcut," he said suddenly, pointing to the left trail that veered off to the side. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice cautious. I had heard stories about hikers getting lost in these woods, and I knew this was the less traveled path. It didn't feel right. "It'll be quicker. We'll get to the cabin before dark. We don't want to be out here after sunset." His voice had a hard edge to it that I hadn't heard before. I could see his jaw tightening, his eyes narrow. I didn't like the sound of it. I wanted to take the longer path, the one that followed the river, because it was easier to follow and felt safer. But I didn't want to start an argument. Not here, not now. So I agreed to go with his decision, even though a part of me felt uneasy. The further we went down the shortcut, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. The trees were thicker here, and the air grew cooler. I kept glancing over at Alex, who was moving ahead, not looking back, and I felt a pang of doubt. Something about this felt off, like we were heading into unknown territory. After a while, Alex stopped. "This way," he said, turning off the path and heading towards a small clearing that I hadn't seen earlier. I hesitated but followed him anyway. The clearing was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest had gone still. "This isn't right," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think we should turn back." Alex didn't answer. He was already moving deeper into the clearing, the map in his hands as he tried to figure out where we were. "Alex," I called after him. "I'm not sure about this. I don't like it." But he was already out of earshot. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I couldn't just let him wander off alone. But when I caught up with him, he was already far ahead, the gap between us widening. I called his name again, but there was no answer. It was as if he couldn't hear me. I watched him disappear into the trees, my heart sinking. What was happening? Why was he acting like this? Finally, my frustration got the best of me. I stopped trying to chase him and stood there in the middle of the forest, angry and confused. I told myself I'd wait for him, that he'd realize he was wrong and come back. But as the minutes ticked by and the shadows grew longer, a knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was fear. I started walking again, this time trying to retrace my steps. I knew I should have stayed put, but the thought of being lost in this dark, tangled forest alone was worse than the idea of going after Alex. I pushed through the underbrush, trying to stay on the path, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the overgrown shrubs, they all blurred together. I couldn't remember which way I had come from, couldn't find the trail. My mind raced as I tried to think of where to go next. The panic set in slowly at first, but soon it was all-consuming. What if I couldn't find him? What if something had happened to him? The forest seemed to close in even tighter around me. The sounds of nature had disappeared entirely, and the only noise was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I kept calling Alex's name, hoping for an answer, but all I heard was silence. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, haunting shadows through the trees. I could feel the darkness creeping in, and the cold, too. I didn't want to be out here when it was dark. I picked up the pace, moving faster, but I was getting more and more lost. Every turn I took led me further into unfamiliar woods. The trees, the rocks, everything felt wrong. The sense of isolation, the vastness of the forest, it was overwhelming. It wasn't long before I lost all sense of direction. I wasn't just worried anymore. I was terrified, couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find something, anything, that looked familiar. But there was nothing. It was just me and the endless forest, the night slowly swallowing me whole. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, a crackling sound in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat, and I rushed toward the noise, desperate for any sign of life. As I pushed through the trees, I saw a flicker of light up ahead, an orange glow that seemed like it had to be a campfire. Relief flooded over me as I hurried toward it, but when I reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't a campfire. It was the dim light of a lantern hanging from a tree, swaying gently in the wind. Beneath it, Alex's backpack sat on the ground, empty. My stomach dropped. I called his name again, but no answer came. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, pressing in, suffocating me. There was no sign of him anywhere. No footsteps, no movement, just the eerie quiet of the forest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break down and cry, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving. I had to find him. But where? I sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing, my mind racing for any possible explanation. But the only thing I could think of was the forest, how easily it could swallow you whole, how it could trick you into thinking you were on the right path when you were actually miles off course. And then it hit me. What if he had been as lost as I was? What if he had wandered off the trail and kept going, convinced he was going in the right direction? What if he was still out there somewhere? I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where to go, no idea if I was even on the right trail. The night was getting colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But then, just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I heard something. A voice, a faint cry in the distance. It was Alex. I knew it. I scrambled to my feet, the terror that had paralyzed me only moments before suddenly giving way to adrenaline. I followed the sound of his voice, my steps quickening as I moved through the darkness. And finally, I found him. He was sitting by a fallen tree, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with fear. "I couldn't find my way back," he whispered. "I thought you'd left me. I thought I was never going to get out of here." I knelt down beside him, wrapping my arms around him, finally feeling the safety of human contact. We had made it, together. But as we sat there in the dark, the silence pressing around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching us, waiting, ready to swallow us whole. We never spoke about what had happened in those woods. It was too much, too strange. But we left the next morning, packed up, and never came back to that cabin. Some parts of the woods you just don't walk through, and some things you never talk about. We never argued about directions again. After hours of hiking through the thick forest, my legs were aching and I was starting to feel a bit exhausted. The trail had been clear at first, well marked with bright yellow paint on trees and small signs to guide the way. But as I pressed on, the markers started to thin out. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was just a stretch where the trail didn't need as much upkeep. But when I looked around, the trees and shrubs were closing in, almost like they were pushing me further into the woods. The path wasn't as clear anymore, and the farther I went, the more it seemed to fade into the dense undergrowth. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, trying to take in my surroundings. My name is Ethan, and I'm no stranger to hiking. I've spent plenty of time out in the wilderness over the years, so the thought of getting lost didn't initially concern me. But there was something unsettling about this place. The woods felt silent, not the usual rustling of wind through leaves or chirping birds, just silence. I couldn't remember the last time I saw or heard anything. My instincts told me something was off, but I didn't want to panic. I pushed the thought aside and started walking again, hoping to find a sign or something familiar. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started to question if I was still on the right track. The trail had become a mere suggestion now, with the ground covered in a tangle of branches and thick ferns. I kept going, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping up on me. It was then that I realized the markers I had passed earlier, those brightly painted strips of yellow, were nowhere to be found. In their place were overgrown vines and weeds, and I started to wonder if I'd somehow missed a turn. I retraced my steps, my heart beginning to pound as I tried to find any familiar signs. But nothing. The markers were gone. It was like the trail had never existed. Panic slowly began to set in as I realized how alone I was. There were no sounds, no signs of anyone around, just the thick forest stretching in all directions. My mind started to race. Was I lost? How far had I wandered off the trail? I tried to remember the last time I had seen a marker, but my mind was a blur of confusion. I checked my phone, but the signal was weak, and it wasn't even showing any map. I knew I had a small battery left, so I didn't want to waste it by relying on a GPS that wouldn't work. I kept walking in what I thought was the direction I had come from. The further I went, though, the more uncertain I became. Every tree looked the same. The ground was uneven, and the underbrush seemed to grow thicker with every step I took. I called out, but my voice didn't seem to reach anyone. The isolation of it all was suffocating. No one would hear me even if I shouted. The reality of being lost in the middle of nowhere began to sink in, and the weight of it was heavy on my chest. Hours had passed, but it felt like days. My legs were sore, and I was dehydrated. I was starting to feel lightheaded. I took a swig of water from my bottle and tried to focus. I needed to stay calm. I had to think. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The temperature was dropping, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. I didn't want to spend the night in the woods, especially with no fire or means to stay warm. I decided to stop for a moment, sit down, and think. Maybe I was too focused on trying to retrace my steps. I needed to stop panicking and assess the situation clearly. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head. But when I opened them again, I realized something. The forest had changed. The trees around me no longer looked familiar. The whole landscape felt different, strange, as if I had wandered into some part of the forest I didn't recognize. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just lost. I had walked in circles. The thought made my stomach drop. I had been walking in one direction, thinking I was going back the way I came, but it didn't make sense anymore. It didn't add up. How could I not have noticed that I was going in circles? I forced myself to keep moving, trying to stay focused. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. The trees were getting thicker, and the underbrush was nearly impossible to push through. Every now and then, I thought I saw a faint shape or shadow in the distance, but when I moved closer, there was nothing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the trees and silence. By the time night had fully fallen, I was out of options. I knew I needed to find shelter, and fast. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was visible in the cold air. My stomach growled with hunger, but there was nothing to eat. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept walking, desperate for any sign of a way out. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. I stopped and froze, looking around. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a cabin. It was old, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. I could hardly believe my eyes. A cabin. I didn't think there was any development out here, but there it was. It didn't look like it had been abandoned too long, but it definitely wasn't well kept. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light flickering from inside. I hesitated for a moment. It felt strange to approach it, but I had no other choice. I was freezing, exhausted, and completely lost. The thought of spending another night out in the woods was unbearable. So, I slowly made my way toward the cabin. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my weight. I pushed the door open a bit further, calling out softly. But there was no answer. No one inside. It was eerily quiet. I stepped in, careful not to make too much noise, and closed the door behind me. The cabin was dark, except for the dim light from a small lamp in the corner. The place smelled musty, and there was dust everywhere. The floor was creaky, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I scanned the room. It was empty. No one had been there for a while, but it was warm inside. I pulled off my jacket and collapsed onto the nearest chair, my legs giving out from exhaustion. I had no idea who owned the cabin or why it was here, but I wasn't going to question my luck. For the first time all day, I felt a small sense of relief. I spent the night in that cabin. I didn't sleep much. Too many thoughts ran through my mind. How had I gotten so lost? What if I hadn't found this place? What if I didn't make it out of the woods? The next morning, I woke up early, the light filtering through the cracks in the walls. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I needed to get back to civilization, but at least I had made it through the night. When I left the cabin, I followed the trail I had stumbled upon earlier, hoping it would lead me to some sort of sign or marker. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally saw the faint outline of a sign ahead. It was a trail marker, one I recognized from the beginning of my hike. I had made it. I was back on track. The experience had left me shaken, but I had learned a valuable lesson that day. No matter how sure you are of your direction, always be aware of your surroundings. The woods can change without warning, and it's easy to lose track of where you are. But I made it out. It was over. I was going home. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A few days in the mountains, some peace and quiet, no distractions. I'd packed light, just the essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, and a few books to keep me company. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, so everything seemed lined up perfectly. I started my hike early in the morning, as soon as the sun started to rise over the ridges. The trail was narrow at first, winding through thick forest, but soon opened up to a more rugged, less traveled path. The kind of trail that makes you feel like you're getting away from it all. Birds were chirping, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was everything I wanted it to be, peaceful and isolated. Around noon, I was passing through a clearing when I saw them, 2 hikers. They were ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction, but they stopped when they saw me. I gave them a friendly wave, like you do when you cross paths with fellow hikers. They didn't wave back. One of them, a man, nodded awkwardly, but the woman next to him didn't even glance my way. There was something off about them, like they were just a little too stiff, a little too mechanical. "Nice day for a hike, huh?" I asked, trying to be friendly. The man's voice was low, almost a mumble. "Yeah, good day." I waited for more, but there was nothing else. Just that uncomfortable silence. I shifted my pack, glancing at the woman. She hadn't said a word. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She stared off into the trees, her expression unreadable. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just not the talkative type, and continued on my way. But as I made my way deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every so often, I would glance behind me and they would be there. Still walking, still ahead of me, but always just far enough to keep a distance. The man's head would turn once in a while, and I'd catch his eyes, but that was it. No more conversation. By mid-afternoon, I began to notice a pattern. Every time I would stop for a break, just to sip some water or catch my breath, I'd hear their voices, faint, like whispers, but unmistakably close. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but it was becoming more frequent. Each time I stopped, they'd be just over a ridge or through a thicket, out of sight but always close. The uneasy feeling started to grow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just on the same trail. After all, it was a relatively popular route, even if it was a little out of the way. But the longer the day went on, the stranger it all felt. It wasn't until I stumbled across their abandoned backpacks that the panic started to creep in. It was just past a small creek when I noticed them. 2 heavy-duty packs lying on the side of the trail, partially covered by fallen leaves. My first instinct was to think they had just taken a break. But something about the way they were left behind, the way they looked almost abandoned, set me on edge. No one would leave their packs like that unless something was wrong. I approached them slowly, my heart racing. The packs looked perfectly fine, no obvious signs of damage or struggle. But when I peered inside one of them, my stomach turned. There was no food, no water, only a few odd items, a first aid kit, a map, some rope. It didn't make sense. The trail was rough, and the weather was unpredictable. Whoever was out here needed their supplies. The thought of the hikers, so distant and strange, now made my blood run cold. I checked the other pack, and it was the same. Just strange, random items. But no food, no real survival gear. I felt my chest tighten as I realized the obvious. Those hikers had been following me. I had been so caught up in my own thoughts, so busy trying to shake the feeling, that I hadn't noticed them staying just behind me. But now it was clear. They had been following me for miles. That I quickly picked up my pace, my mind racing. There was no way I was going to camp in this area tonight. I needed to find a safer spot, somewhere more open, more visible. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but the sound of their voices, those faint, distant whispers, kept echoing in my ears. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Were they trying to get closer without me noticing? Or were they simply waiting for the right moment? The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the path. I couldn't risk staying on the trail any longer. I turned off into the woods, hoping to find some sort of clearing or an area where I could make camp. But the further I went, the more isolated I became. There were no signs of life, no animals, no birds, just silence. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like lead. Hours passed, and I was starting to lose track of time when I finally stumbled across a small cabin. It was old, but still standing. Weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a small porch. It looked abandoned, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. I approached it cautiously, my senses heightened. But when I pushed the door open, I was met with the comforting smell of old wood and dust. It was empty. I immediately decided to make camp inside. I locked the door and set up my tent on the cabin's floor. As I sat there, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sounds outside, the wind, the rustling of leaves felt too deliberate, too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint knock. It came from the back of the cabin, light but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way anyone could have followed me in this deep. I had lost them hours ago, right? Another knock, louder this time. I didn't move. I stayed still, my body frozen with fear. Whoever was out there, whoever had been following me all day, was now outside, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, my hands trembling. The knock came again, this time followed by a faint scratching sound. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to listen. There was something out there, moving, but I couldn't see it. My heart was pounding in my ears as I debated my next move. The door was locked, but I couldn't stay in this cabin forever. Eventually, I would need to leave. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, on the wooden porch outside. Someone was pacing. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. My mind raced through every possibility, every scenario. They could just be hikers, but the way they had acted, the way they had disappeared, wasn't normal. And now I wasn't sure if they were alone. Finally, the door creaked open. It wasn't as loud as I expected, and I quickly ducked into the shadows, hiding in the back corner of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting to see if anyone would come inside. Seconds dragged into minutes, and I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, entering the cabin. I held my flashlight tightly, trying not to make a sound, my mind racing. I didn't know who was in here with me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them get close. It was the kind of day where the sun barely made it through the thick clouds, and the air felt damp with the promise of rain. I had never been good at tracking, but the desperation in the voice of the mother had been enough to convince me to take on the search. The child had gone missing in the woods just outside of our town. Nothing unusual at first, just a little boy who had wandered too far, they thought. But hours had passed, and no one had heard a thing since. The woods weren't far from my cabin, but I knew them like the back of my hand. It was the same place I'd gone to escape from everything. Work, people, the noise of everyday life. I grabbed my pack, slipped on my boots, and headed out the door. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting its slow descent, casting long shadows over the trees. The trail from where the boy was last seen led into the dense forest, thick with evergreens and underbrush. I wasn't sure how far I would need to go to find him, but I knew it wasn't going to be quick. After a quick glance at the small group of volunteers already searching in the distance, I decided to head off on my own. It felt like a decision I would regret, but at the time I felt like I could do more than wait. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the kind of forest floor that sinks with every step. Leaves crackled as I pushed my way through thick undergrowth, my senses alert for any sign of movement. It didn't take long before I saw the first sign. A branch bent at an odd angle, a shirt caught in the brush. It was torn, jagged, as if someone or something had grabbed it and pulled. I knelt down and inspected it, but there was no blood, no real signs of struggle. Just the fabric, ripped in a way that didn't make sense. I stood up and looked around, feeling the first pang of unease creeping through me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just silence. I pressed on. Deeper I went, the more the world around me seemed to close in. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, just a sense that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shift in the air, a creak of a branch in the distance. But the further I moved, the more it intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. There was a clearing ahead, and I pushed forward toward it, hoping to get a better view of the landscape. But when I stepped into the open space, the ground was different. The earth had a spongy texture, like I had wandered into a bog. The trees around me were gnarled, twisted, as if they had grown to entangle each other. I paused, scanning the area for any signs of the child, but the only thing that caught my attention was a trail, a series of small footprints in the mud, leading deeper into the woods. The prints were small, too small to belong to an adult, but they didn't seem to go in a straight line. Instead, they wove in and out, curving in odd directions. I squatted down and traced the marks with my finger, trying to make sense of the path. It wasn't what I expected. No straight line of movement, no clear direction, just circles. I straightened up and glanced around. That's when I noticed it. The trees. Something about them seemed wrong. It wasn't just the way they twisted or the way the light filtered through the branches, but the feeling they gave me. They seemed to bend toward me, almost like they were leaning in, watching. I had read about pareidolia before, the way people can see faces in shadows, but this felt different. These trees didn't just look like faces, they felt like eyes. I pushed the thought aside and focused back on the trail. The footsteps led on, spiraling out like a maze. I followed them for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the strange pattern. It wasn't until the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the forest floor, that I realized I wasn't just following a trail. I was getting lost. The landscape, once so familiar, now seemed foreign. The trees had changed. The path was gone. I turned around, but I didn't recognize the way back. The more I tried to retrace my steps, the more everything felt off. The trees were no longer where they had been. The clearing I had passed through earlier was nowhere in sight. I was surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar trunks, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I was lost. I didn't panic immediately. There was no point. I had been in the woods enough to know the first rule. Don't panic, because panic only makes things worse. But deep down, I felt a growing fear. The air had gotten colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The shadows were longer now, and the silence had returned, deeper, heavier than before. I heard something, a snap of a twig, sharp and sudden. I froze. It was faint, but it was there, somewhere to my left. I turned in that direction, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just more trees, the same dark shapes looming in the dusk. I took a deep breath and kept moving, trying to remain calm, trying to convince myself that the boy was still out there. Maybe he was lost too. Maybe we'd find each other. But as I walked on, the tracks grew more erratic. The circles grew tighter, spiraling toward a single point. I found myself following the prints to the base of an old, gnarled oak. The ground around it was disturbed. The earth churned as if something had been dug up. And there, lying in the dirt, was a small, torn scrap of cloth. It was the same fabric as before, the shirt from earlier. But now I wasn't sure whether it was the boy's shirt or something else. That's when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. I stood there, my breath coming fast now, sweat forming on the back of my neck. The fear that had been creeping up on me finally took hold, and I realized that I wasn't just following the boy anymore. I had been led somewhere I shouldn't be. The footsteps had been my own. The sound of the earth shifting, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That had been me all along. But this was different. The circles in the mud, the strange pattern, the feeling of being watched. It all clicked. I wasn't chasing the boy. I had been chasing something else. Something that had led me in circles, making me think I was searching for a lost child when all along, I was just getting deeper into its trap. I took a step back, my mind racing, and then I stopped. The realization hit me hard. There was no child. The prints were a trick, a distraction. Something had been manipulating me, leading me further into the woods, away from safety, away from help. I took another step back, then turned, my feet moving faster as I retraced my steps. This time, for real. I wasn't looking for a child. I was looking for my way out. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. The forest felt like it was swallowing me whole. I could hear my heartbeat now, pounding in my chest, as I pushed through the underbrush. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. Every rustle in the leaves sent a surge of adrenaline through my body. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and saw the edge of the forest. The familiar road was ahead of me, just beyond the line of trees. I didn't stop. I ran. I didn't look back until I was safely at the edge of the woods, gasping for breath. The missing child? I never found him, but I found something else that day. Something I couldn't explain. Something I'd never be able to forget. Maybe the boy had never been lost at all. Maybe I had been the one lost from the start. But whatever it was that led me into the forest, I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back. It was late afternoon when Jake and I reached the peak of the ridge. The air was thin, and the mountain's cool breeze hit us with the kind of refreshment that only comes after a long hike. The view was stunning. The whole valley spread out beneath us like a patchwork quilt of forests and fields. But as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, I felt a creeping unease. There was something off about the trail we were on. It didn't quite match what we had seen on the map earlier that day. Jake and I had been friends since college, both of us avid hikers, but this was our first time tackling the rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We'd spent the day following a trail marked on the map, but the farther we went, the more disorienting the landscape became. It didn't help that the GPS signal kept flickering in and out, especially as we descended into thicker, denser forest. The map had been a lifeline up to that point, but now it felt almost useless. We stopped to check our coordinates. Jake fiddled with his phone, but the signal was practically non-existent. He looked at me, brows furrowed, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't the trail we had planned on. "I think we missed something," he muttered, looking around at the dense trees that now crowded the path. I nodded, glancing at the surroundings. The trail was definitely changing. The narrow path we had followed for hours had split several times, each new direction confusing us more. The map showed a single route, but here, there were multiple forks that didn't match anything on the paper. The trees were thickening, and a chill was creeping into the air. It was becoming harder to see as the shadows lengthened. I pulled out the map again, trying to make sense of it. The ink was faded, and there was no clear way to match our current location to the map's marked paths. A few trails seemed to have disappeared altogether, replaced by overgrown patches of brambles and tall grass. Others led to dead ends or twisted back in the opposite direction, leaving us no clearer on how to find our way back. I felt the familiar pang of worry settle in my chest. The sun was almost gone, and we were well into the unknown now. The mountain's terrain wasn't forgiving, and with every passing minute, the shadows stretched longer and darker. We could hear the distant call of some birds, but other than that, the forest had grown eerily quiet. A deep, unsettling silence that seemed to press in on us. Jake was pacing back and forth now, muttering under his breath as he checked his phone again. "I don't like this. We should have turned back sooner." I nodded, but there was no turning back now. We were too far into the woods, and heading back the way we came wasn't a guaranteed solution. In fact, I wasn't even sure which way that was anymore. The trail had become a maze of conflicting directions, and the fading light made it even harder to navigate. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his voice tight. He wasn't used to being in this kind of situation. Neither of us were. "We need to make a decision. Either we set up camp here for the night and try to figure this out in the morning, or we keep moving, hoping to find something familiar," I said, feeling the weight of the moment. Neither choice was ideal. Staying out here overnight meant more risk. Wild animals, colder temperatures, and the possibility that we might make things worse. But continuing in the dark was equally dangerous. We could easily get more lost. "Let's keep going," Jake said finally, his voice determined, but I could hear the uncertainty there too. He was just as scared as I was. "We can't just sit here. Maybe we'll find something soon." We packed up our gear, keeping our voices low, trying not to let the anxiety in our chests show. The decision had been made, and now we had to follow through. But with every step, the forest grew darker, the trees pressing in tighter. The sounds of the wilderness had quieted even further, and it felt as if we were the only two people on Earth. It was at least an hour later when the first real sign of trouble showed itself. We had been walking for what felt like forever, but every direction we tried led us deeper into the woods. We came across another fork in the path, one we hadn't seen on the map at all. It didn't feel right, nothing did anymore. "That wasn't here before," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar path. I could barely make out the outline of the trail, barely distinguishable in the failing light. The trees had closed in completely, blocking most of the sky above. I glanced at my watch. It was already past 8 p.m. We had been on the move for hours. My legs ached, and the back of my neck tingled with a strange sense of dread. "Maybe we should just make camp here," I suggested. "We can't keep going like this. It's too dark to find anything now." Jake hesitated. "I guess you're right. Let's set up before it gets any worse." The air had grown colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine as we made camp. We set up our tents as quickly as possible, trying to keep calm, but the forest seemed to press in closer as we worked. Once everything was set up, we huddled together, sitting on the ground with our backs to the fire, listening to the sounds of the night around us. But there was something unsettling about the silence. The forest was too still, too quiet. It wasn't natural. There should have been the usual sounds, crickets, owls, maybe the rustling of animals in the underbrush, but it felt as if everything had gone completely still. We ate what little food we had left, trying to keep our minds off the growing sense of unease. But the darkness was oppressive, the kind of darkness that seems to stretch on forever, swallowing every trace of light. As the fire crackled, I glanced over at Jake. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around nervously. He knew, just like I did, that something was wrong. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we both fell into a restless sleep. But the night didn't pass quietly. The sounds that had been absent for so long suddenly returned, but they weren't comforting. It was as if something was moving out there in the woods, just beyond the edge of our firelight. A shifting in the trees, a rustle in the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something out there watching. The night stretched on forever, and neither of us slept much. The next morning, we packed up quickly. The daylight was a relief, but it didn't change the fact that we were still lost. I tried the GPS again, but it was still useless. We had to trust our instincts now, the map long forgotten. We retraced our steps, slowly and cautiously, but nothing felt familiar. Every tree, every path seemed like it belonged to a different world. Then, just as we were about to give up hope, we stumbled upon a small clearing. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the forest, another confusing path that led nowhere. But as we stepped closer, I saw it, a cabin, a small, wooden cabin, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't anywhere. But there it was, standing alone in the clearing, its walls weathered and aged. The door was slightly ajar, and the roof had seen better days, but it was a cabin, and it was real. We didn't know what to do. The place was empty, abandoned, and there was no telling how long it had been sitting there. But it was shelter, and we needed it. We stepped inside cautiously, the air inside musty and cold. It felt like stepping back in time. The old furniture covered in dust, the remnants of a life long gone. We stayed there until we could find our way back out. It wasn't the end of the nightmare, but it was the beginning of the end. The cabin had provided us with something we hadn't expected: hope. By the next morning, we had figured out our bearings and made our way back to safety. We had wandered too far, but we had found our way home. It was supposed to be an easy hike, just a quick trip up into the foothills near a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest. I'd been on this trail before, and I knew it well enough to trust my instincts. But somewhere along the way, I made a wrong turn. One wrong step, and it led me off course. I had come to the trailhead at sunrise, eager to clear my head. The air was crisp, and the trees, tall and straight like sentinels, seemed to pull me deeper into the woods with every step. There wasn't much to the path at first. A dirt trail wide enough for two people to walk side by side, soft underfoot with the occasional puddle from the morning dew. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. It was peaceful, like the kind of morning that makes you forget about everything outside of nature. The first mile passed without issue, and I reached the fork in the trail. Normally, I would have taken the right path. It was the one that looped around a small lake where I liked to sit and rest, but I found my mind wandering. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the ground. A small sign at the junction pointed left toward a trail I hadn't seen before. Unmarked, it read in faint letters. I'd never noticed it before, but it looked well enough used. I wondered if maybe it led to something new, something I hadn't explored yet. So, on a whim, I decided to take it. The first few hundred yards were easy enough. The trail was narrower than the one I'd been following, but still passable. It wound through dense trees that blocked out the sun, leaving only slivers of light filtering down. As I walked, I felt a slight thrill of excitement. I was off the beaten path, away from the crowds of hikers that usually followed the main route. It was just me and the forest now. But the further I went, the more the trail seemed to narrow, the ground beneath my boots becoming uneven. Soon, it became a series of loose rocks and thick underbrush. It didn't feel quite like a trail anymore, but I had come so far and it seemed silly to turn back now. After all, I was an experienced hiker used to rough terrain. I could handle it. The next hour was filled with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching on the ground, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional bird call. The deeper I went, the more I began to wonder where this trail was taking me. It wasn't like any of the maps I'd seen. The trees seemed denser here, the forest more enclosed. I hadn't seen any markers for a while. I wasn't sure if the trail had even been maintained recently. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, it was too late. The trail had completely disappeared. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the area around me. The forest looked the same in every direction, dense, green, and unyielding. I tried to follow the path I thought I'd been on, but it was hopeless. There were no more clear signs of a trail, no more footprints, nothing that made sense. The only thing that remained were the trees, the rocks, and the growing silence. A twinge of panic crept into my chest. I was lost. It's a terrifying realization, one that creeps up on you slowly. At first, you think you can just retrace your steps. But with each turn, with each look around, the world around you starts to blur. It starts to feel like the forest is closing in. I tried to calm myself. It was still early enough in the day that I had time to figure this out. I took out my phone to check for a signal, but as I expected, there was none. The trees and hills around me blocked everything. I thought about marking the trees, making my own trail, but the landscape here was dense. Every direction seemed the same, and the more I wandered, the less sure I became. As the afternoon wore on, the sky started to dim. The trees had blocked most of the sun by now, and the light was fading fast. That's when I saw the first marker. A tree scarred deeply in the shape of a long vertical line. It wasn't natural. Whoever had made that mark had done it with purpose. I approached cautiously, unsure of what it meant, but I wasn't going to leave it unexplored. Maybe it was a sign. Someone else had been here. I continued walking, following what I hoped was some kind of direction. The light was almost gone now, and the shadows were thickening, stretching long across the ground. I tried to move faster, but every step felt more uncertain. The trail, if it even was a trail anymore, had become a mere suggestion. The markers grew more frequent, but they didn't seem to lead anywhere. There was something strange about them. The carvings in the trees were inconsistent, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep. The rocks piled in odd shapes, like they were placed there intentionally. At times, I'd think I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. Still, the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone kept growing. I stumbled over a large rock and caught myself before falling. As I did, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. The marks were faint, but unmistakable. Someone had been here recently. My heart skipped a beat. Were they still here? Had I been following them? Or had they been following me? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I felt the weight of the growing darkness settling in. It was getting harder to see, and the air was thickening with the onset of evening. I had no choice but to keep moving. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Safety, shelter, or just the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. But the trail kept getting harder to follow. There were no signs, no landmarks, just trees, rocks, and the unsettling quiet of the forest. My body ached from the effort, and my mind was beginning to fray. Every turn felt wrong, and each step deeper into the woods felt like a step away from finding my way back. By now, I was completely disoriented. The markers were no help, and the path seemed to disappear with every step. I stopped and took a breath, trying to steady myself. My stomach was tight with nerves, my thoughts racing. I had to keep my head clear, but with each passing minute, the feeling of being watched grew. I wasn't just lost, I was being watched. I stopped again, scanning the trees. There, just out of sight, a flash of movement. Something or someone was there. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, trying to push the fear down, but it was hard. The forest seemed to close in on me. There was a sense of pressure, an invisible weight pushing in from all sides. I forced myself to stay calm, but my mind kept racing. My breathing became shallow. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw something ahead. A break in the trees. Clearing. I didn't hesitate. I pushed forward, stepping into the open space. And then I saw it. A small cabin tucked away at the edge of the forest. It wasn't much, but it was real. A shelter. I ran toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I could see the windows were dark. No signs of life. I didn't care. I needed shelter. I needed safety. I reached for the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened with a creak. Inside, it was just a simple, rundown cabin. Dust covered the floors, and there was a faint smell of wood and mildew in the air. But it was a place to rest, a place to catch my breath. I didn't know who had built this cabin or why it was here, but at that moment, it was my salvation. I locked the door behind me, not that it would have made much of a difference. I didn't feel completely safe, not really, but the cabin was a place to stop, to collect myself. I found an old chair by the window and sat down. As the night settled in, I kept my eyes on the forest outside. The stillness of the woods pressed against the cabin walls. And somewhere, in the distance, I thought I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't get any closer. By morning, I was ready to leave the cabin behind. I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten here, but the woods felt different now. The fear that had followed me seemed to vanish as I stepped back onto the trail. I retraced my steps carefully, marking trees and rocks as best I could. By mid-morning, I finally found the familiar path again. It was as if the woods had let me go. I made my way back to the main trail, exhausted but grateful. As I reached the trailhead, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder at the woods. They were still there, silent, waiting, as if they knew I'd be back one day. But for now, I was safe.